Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you about an American issue that's had a huge amount of cut through here in Britain and in Europe. Not the Venezuela question, that has as well, obviously. But the Minnesota Somali fraud scandal. I wanted to get your views on that because, I guess this also touches on questions of American sovereignty and America's borders and the question of who comes to America, what America stands for. This has had huge cut through here. People are talking about it quite widely, not least because we face similar problems in Britain and in other European countries. Listeners will be familiar that there was this vast Somali fraud scheme, as far as we can see, where lots of money was taken from the taxpayer and used to fund these educational and charity groups that didn't actually do anything. Give us a little update on what's happening there, and I guess what you think that tells us about America at the moment and what its problems are.
Well, it's stunning, and it confirms so many things that many conservatives and people on the right have generally suspected, but that up till now, was not confirmed or wasn't going to be reported by the mainstream media. One of the parts of the story I think is most interesting is that an independent journalist just went to these daycares that were receiving taxpayer funding and just showed that there were no children there. That in fact, that these and of course, you have a sign, this quality learning center, it was supposed to say, but learning is misspelled in the sign. So the whole thing was just an absolute utter sham. And a guy who just, went there with his cell phone and started recording, he exposed this. And, before this, you'd had whistleblowers, there was a poor Somali guy who actually was trying to draw attention to some of these abuses that people in his own community were perpetrating. And he wound up, getting thrown out and getting harassed by other Somalis and going back to Somalia and getting harassed there. I mean, and then you think about the United States mainstream media. Whenever there were indications that something like this was happening, the mainstream media would basically take the side of the fraudsters. They would say it's racist to question what's happening here. Oh, how can you go after poor people like this? It's so wonderful that they have these charitable daycare centers and other things. Hey, isn't it great that you have these immigrants who are entrepreneurial and who are starting businesses like daycares? Well, they're very entrepreneurial, and it really is ingenious to be able to get, millions, maybe even billions of dollars from taxpayers by starting completely fraudulent entities. I just think it's a wonderful illustration of the naivete of so many ordinary good Americans of goodwill, and the very sinister quality of so many, in the American statist left, who say that, who they know that things like this are happening, and they do not want you to investigate it. They will discourage it. They will call you a racist. It's been wonderful to see that Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota has had to, suspend his efforts at getting reelected because, this scandal is so big that he can't run away from it. And hopefully it's going to not only damage his administration, but also his party, which, has been in charge of Minnesota for quite some time. And it just, but it's not just Minnesota. I mean, as you say, this is something where Europe has this problem as well. Other American states have this problem, and it's going to take independent journalists to go and expose this stuff because the mainstream doesn't want to do it. Even the Republican Party in Minnesota, people you would think, hey, they're the conservative party, they would want to expose these things. They were discouraging to anyone who brought up these problems. You have, Republican officers like officials like Tom Emmer, who's a congressman from Minnesota, actually a congressman with some degree of leadership status within the Republican Party in Congress. He whenever a constituent of his would bring this up in a town hall, Emmer would try to say, "Well, it sounds like you're getting kind of racist there. It sounds like you're getting into something you don't know anything about." So the Republican Party too was trying to hush this up and overlook it because the Somalis that have been brought in, they're tens if not hundreds of thousands. They are a very significant voting bloc now in Minnesota. And Europe, of course, has this issue with all of the newcomers that it's brought in as well. So if they're breaking the law, if they are, it could be anything from, female genital mutilation through to welfare scams, grooming scandals. All of this is something that winds up getting suppressed by the mainstream media and by the political parties on both sides, the main, establishment politics, because it's embarrassing to say this new constituency that we're all supposed to say is going to instantly assimilate and become westernized might in fact be doing things that are criminal and may in fact be ripping off taxpayers or inflicting hardships, including on its own people. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that really ticks me off so much here is that when the left talks about racism, that police are racist, and that talking about grooming gangs is racist. Well, of course, so many of the victims of these crimes in America's inner cities and elsewhere, it's not just white people. It's most often people within those communities themselves. It's African Americans. It's violence within immigrant communities. These things, are perfectly acceptable to white liberals as long as you have that mass migration continuing, and as long as you have the chaos in many of our cities continuing. White liberals see that as an acceptable price to pay for multiculturalism and for the mass immigration they prefer. So I think there really is a kind of avalanche effect here, where hopefully this scandal in Minnesota not only starts to change the way Americans look at what's happening, but also wakes up Europe too.